beyond the thunder and lightning, past the clouds, over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star. Opened the earth, rocking with blood-soaked feet. She challenged the whip, the gun, the knife. She challenged the fire, pulled from the bodies of slaves, made into laws, prisons, and courts.
Good afternoon and welcome back. You know, when you listened to the Biden, Blinken, Harris narrative and to those who continue to defend the U.S. involvement in Ukraine, they love to discuss defending democracy. We have to defend Ukraine because we have to defend democracy. Well, there's a piece in Sputnik International entitled European Democracy Kills Anyone with Different Opinion. The failed attempt on Prime Minister Fico's life was because he sought dialogue with Russia and peaceful political options, said Lubos Blaha. I hope I got that somewhere near close. Deputy leader of Slovakia's Smer party, speaking to Sputnik. Quote, imagine you have a different opinion and somebody wants to kill you. What is it? This is European democracy now. This is European freedom now, end quote, Lubos Blaha said. Was democracy ever the point of this failed mission in Ukraine? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they take place in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which most events occur. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they take place, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is, are those claiming to defend democracy really the ones who pose its greatest threat? My guest is an author, independent journalist, political analyst, reporter for RT, and the founder of the Center for Political Innovation, Caleb Maupin. As always, Caleb, welcome back.
Sure. Glad to be here. How you doing?
Man, I'm doing great. And thank you again so much for joining me today. Before we get to the Fico story, there is another very disturbing story unfolding closer to home. A Palestinian protest leader at Columbia University was arrested by the Department of Homeland Security agents this past Saturday night, despite having a green card. His attorney said Mahmoud Khalil, who as a Palestinian graduate student, was a leader in negotiations between protesters and Columbia University officials last spring. He was stopped by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents who told him his student visa had been revoked. His attorney, Amy Greer, said in a written statement, when Khalil told agents he was a lawful permanent resident holding a green card, agents detained him anyway, she said. Caleb, this is disturbing on a number of levels. Your thoughts?
Well, the first thing we need to point out is that freedom of speech applies to everyone in this country, whether you're a citizen or not, whether you're in the country legally or undocumentedly. Everyone in the country has freedom of speech. The Constitution doesn't say freedom of speech only applies to citizens. That said, one could argue from a legal standpoint that, okay, if someone's coming into the country and they're breaking the law, that they need to be held accountable for that maybe we should revoke their visa. But it's important to point out this individual was not breaking the law. He was not illegally occupying Columbia University. He did the opposite. He was a negotiator. He was one who brought a settlement to the protests that were happening at Columbia University. And he was somebody who negotiated with the police and the students, served as a go-between. And so this retaliatory move is very, very unacceptable in my view. Now, Donald Trump tweeted about it. I don't know if you saw, but he tweeted about it, and he says this is one of many, many steps to come. And I guess he's not the first. Khalil is the second. There was a Chinese national student in San Francisco who was deported a couple weeks ago under similar charges. So this is absolutely wrong. I know there's protests happening across the country, and I'm with the protesters. I don't think that your free speech in this country goes away. I will say that I'm paying attention to some of what the Trump administration is saying, and it's oddly worded. And I have to ask questions about the fact that the United States did reach out to Iran to restart nuclear negotiations. The Supreme Leader said no, and many people in the Trump camp allege there is Iranian backing covertly for these protests, and if this is some kind of retaliation because Iran doesn't want to negotiate. I also have to ask, at the same time, you look at this. Donald Trump said earlier, he said that any university that is allowing illegal protests will lose their funding. Well, illegal protests, by definition, are not allowed. So I don't know what campus is allowing illegal protests. Oh, it's against the law. Go ahead and do it on our campus. That's not happening. And there's odd wording going on here. So I'm very opposed. I think, Mahmoud Khalil should get his student visa back. He should be able to continue his education, no matter what his views of the Israel-Palestine conflict. End of story.
So the story continues. Trump has promised to deport international students who participated in pro-jihadist protests on college campuses. The arrest came a day after the Trump administration said it was canceling $400 million in federal contracts and grants to Columbia because university officials have not done enough to prevent anti-Semitism on campus. Trump's administration said that they're going to revoke student visas of Hamas sympathizers and warned, quote, resident aliens who joined in the pro-jihadist protests, we will find you, we will deport you. He has also said foreign, quote, agitators will be imprisoned or permanently sent back to the country from which they came, end quote. This is getting, Caleb, to your point, at the very core of the First Amendment, because this isn't we're not talking about sedition. Basically, what we're talking about, as Donald Trump has explained it and others, is we're talking about the misperception of anti-Semitism. That's what's really at the crux of this. Not sedition, not talking about the overthrow of the government. This has nothing to do with challenging war. This is the misperception of anti-Semitism.
Indeed. Now, there's a couple thoughts that come to mind. First of all, Donald Trump is just kind of appropriating the language of the hard right Netanyahu Zionists among his base. When he talks about jihadist, right? Well, we all know that, I mean, we should know that in Islam, jihad is a spiritual concept. My understanding is that many of the people on the battlefields of Syria, the Revolutionary Guards of Iran, deeply religious Muslims who were fighting against ISIS, they considered what they were doing, fighting against ISIS and protecting Christians, to be jihad because they were standing against evil. I know that there are Muslims who struggle with their own addictions, with drug addiction or other forms of compulsive behavior, and they talk about how they're waging a daily jihad against the temptation and the sinful behaviors they might have. So this idea that somehow being a quote jihadist is grounds for being deported, that is Zionist language, and we're supposed to think of 9/11. We're supposed to think of the 9/11 hijackers or ISIS or something like that. But students protesting for Palestine are nothing like that, and jihad is just a religious concept in the Islamic faith that can be interpreted in many, many different ways. However, I do want to point this out, right? A couple things. First, Donald Trump is kind of doing an odd tap dance because it has been revealed that the United States government is in direct talks with Hamas at the moment. And that is a huge break with longstanding U.S. policy to never negotiate or talk with the Palestinian resistance, who the U.S. government considers to be terrorists. And it was after that was revealed that Donald Trump seems to have gotten rather defensive. And you have to wonder, how was that revealed? It was mainstream media, directly asked the White House spokesperson, and she said, okay, yes, that's true. But, and it was almost like, and Donald Trump gave his joint speech. It wasn't technically a State of the Union. And you'll notice he did not say the word Israel one time in the entire speech. He spoke for 2 hours, one of the longest, one of the longest State of the Union speeches of a sitting president. He did not mention Israel the entire time. So now it seems like Donald Trump is kind of doing a tap dance after kind of, dissing Israel by negotiating with Hamas, reaching out to Iran to negotiate, not mentioning them in his State of the Union speech. Donald Trump is trying to keep pro-Israel folks happy, while his policy and foreign policy doesn't seem to be leaning into the directions that they would like. The other thing that I have said is that Columbia University, that's part of the Ivy League. And the Ivy League schools in particular, according to Zbigniew Brzezinski and U.S. foreign policy strategists, play an internationalist role. Students from around the world, wealthy young people from all across the planet, Africa, Asia, Latin America, they go to Harvard, they go to Columbia, they go to Yale and the Ivy League schools, and that's where they're won to loving the United States. And they make connections there. They have a great experience at these very, very expensive Ivy League schools. And then they go back to their country as people that have a positive view of the United States, people that are tied in with American business circles, et cetera. And the Ivy League schools almost play an international role. They're not even really there to serve the U.S. economy. They're there to kind of serve this kind of global apparatus centered around the United States. And so having students at Yale and Columbia and Harvard marching around with pro-Palestine flags is very, very good for U.S. soft power relations. People from Muslim countries can come and see, okay, sure, the American government supports Israel, but look, we've got lots of pro-Palestine people, and they're part of America, and they're allowed to be part of American discourse, etc. But what's odd is that there is so much pro-Israeli money and influence on these campuses that they can't do that to serve the soft power intelligence purpose. It would be in the interest of the U.S. intelligence apparatus for there to be all kinds of pro-Palestine protests at Yale and Harvard and Columbia. But there's so many pro-Israel donors at these schools that just can't stand it. They were driving around Harvard with a doxing truck with the name of pro-Palestine students with their faces on it. This shows that, again, this is divisions among our ruling elite, divisions among our deep state and our intelligence apparatus, et cetera. And this is kind of the dysfunctionality of the U.S. state at this time.
Help me work through what I consider to be some inconsistency, if not hypocrisy. I need a greater mind than mine, so I'm going to turn to yours. Help me understand help. Okay. So help me understand how Mahmoud Khalil, Palestinian graduate student, has done nothing violent, has not advocated any violence. Actually, as you mentioned earlier, was a negotiator in the unrest last semester, is now being threatened to be deported, have his green card rescinded, and they're threatening to deport him. When Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, that was his name before he helped the United States overthrow the al-Assad government in Syria. He's now known as Ahmad al-Shara. How the United States can work with him. And I want to say yesterday, he chopped off the heads of some Alawites in Syria because he believed that they were threatening his attempts to reunite the country. So I'm seeing some inconsistency here, I think, some hypocrisy. I need a greater mind than mine. Caleb Maupin, help me work through this.
Well, I see a huge amount of hypocrisy here. I mean, no doubt about it. Yeah, no, it's not just you. This is a student who got a visa, came to the United States, followed the law, has pro-Palestine views, and was able to negotiate the end of an illegal student occupation that he didn't participate in. He negotiated the end of it as the go-between between the police and the students. He hasn't broken the law, but they're saying because of his views that he's not entitled to a green card. And I just think that's not constitutional. And we'll see. I expect this will go to court, and we will see if it stands up in court. My interpretation is that this is Donald Trump trying to throw a bone to the pro-Israel faction of his base, and also kind of doing a nervous tap dance because he is negotiating with Hamas, because he didn't mention Israel in his remarks, because he did offer to reopen Iran negotiations. So Israel is angry with Trump right now. So he's doing this. And honestly, Donald Trump probably wants leftists to go out and loudly protest against it as loud as they possibly can, because that will show the base. Look, I'm going after them. See those Palestine protesters on the campus that you hate so much? Well, I'm sticking it to them. Look how mad they are. And I see this actually in a way. I mean, it's wrong what Trump is doing, but it's kind of strategically brilliant. And they picked a very high profile individual. They didn't just pick some random student, but somebody who negotiated with the police. And that this kind of serves Trump's ends very strategically. And it'll get a lot of publicity. It'll get these student activists loud, angry at him. He can show that he's harming them. And it'll be hard to say that Donald Trump is not a friend of Israel, as Donald Trump takes some interesting moves that are not particularly what Israel would like them to do. So, we have to interpret this. You can't interpret everything in terms of just right and wrong. I mean, obviously this is wrong, but is it strategic for what Trump is trying to achieve? Certainly it is. I will say one thing that I have to say, as somebody who went to court with Chairman Omali Yeshitela and Penny Hess and Jesse Neville, what was done to them, where their home was raided by the FBI, their homes were raided, then they were indicted for their speech, charged with being foreign agents. What was done to them was absolutely horrendous. And I went to federal court with them, and I raised their case at the United Nations and internationally. And I'm glad to see all these people standing up and supporting Mahmoud Khalil, and I'm with them. But why are so many people speaking up for Mahmoud Khalil who wouldn't touch the Uhuru 3 case? Why is that? Is that because Biden was the president who did it? Is that because it wasn't Palestine that was the issue? It was allied ties to Russia. And I must say that, the fact that Tucker Carlson would speak up for the Uhuru 3, but many of the voices that immediately swung into action for Mahmoud Khalil, but were silent about the Uhuru case, that shows Democratic Party bias and infiltration in a lot of our civil liberties institutions in the United States, and that they have a relationship where they are loyal to the Democrat Party and they are opposed to Donald Trump. And that is really, really unfortunate, because the Biden administration and the Democrat Party is no friend of the Palestinian movement, as we saw under Biden's leadership.
Well, and since you raised that issue, I would also throw in many of those same forces have been conspicuously silent as it relates to Haiti. And you can't be selective in your ire. You can't be selective in your outrage. Or as I have said a number, and I think you've heard me say this a number of times, you can't compromise for the sake of political expediency on the front end and then try to claim the moral high ground on the back end. You've got to be consistent, and right is right. And the one thing about right, it's always right. And the one thing about wrong, it's always wrong. So you can't spring into action now for Mahmoud Khalil, but to your point, be conspicuously silent when it relates to Chairman Omali Yeshitela and Haiti, for example.
Absolutely. And my position, which is why I support Khalil, which is why I support Chairman O'Malley, which is why I stood with Scott Ritter when his home was raided, is that my speech as someone in this country about international issues and foreign policy should not be criminalized, right? If I try to break the law, if I punch somebody or try to blow up a building, you can throw me in jail all you want. But if I make a statement about Russia and Ukraine, if I make a statement about Haiti, if I make a statement about Palestine, and I live here, I have the right to do it. And that's that. And Mahmoud should have his green card returned to him, and he should not face any further legal harassment of any kind over his pro-Palestine activities. And the same for Scott Ritter, and the same for the Uhuru Three. And we just need to be consistent on that front. And I support Khalil on those grounds. And if I didn't, I would be a hypocrite.
Which is why I mentioned sedition in the earlier part of the conversation, because I wanted to be very, very clear that the language that he has been using, the practices that he has been engaging in, have absolutely nothing to do with threatening the government. All he is guilty of is threatening the sensitivities of Zionists.
Indeed. And why is it against the rules to offend pro-Israeli students? Do pro-Israeli students not routinely offend, Muslim students? And this is an area where the left and the right, you have to look at them both. They're both hypocritical, because we've heard for the last 4 years from the Trump camp about free speech, right? And opposing cancel culture. And you have the right to say things, even if they offend people. And, you shouldn't have your Facebook taken down or your Twitter taken down because you hurt somebody's feelings or whatever. And they make fun of the safe spaces on college campuses, et cetera. But now the position of the right seems to be that Zionists and pro-Israeli students deserve to have the campus be their safe space where no one's allowed to criticize Israel. Well, that's not how these things work, right? Yes, if people are disrupting, if they're threatening you, that's not acceptable. But disagreeing with Israel, you don't have the right to say that students shouldn't do that. Now, I'll criticize the left too, because many of the very rules that are being used to go after pro-Palestine students, not by ICE, but by campus administrations, are rules that the campus left has very much, worked to promote. I know, Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, not the original one, but the current incarnation of it, which is a leftist campus group that has, groups around the country on different campuses, which is largely dominated by a leftist group called the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. They've made it their mission to get Republican student organizations banned from college campuses. They've gone after Turning Points USA, et cetera, and they will dig into people's private servers and dig up some comment that somebody made that was transphobic or something, and on that grounds try to get Republican student organizations banned from college campuses because we have a rule: no racism, no sexism. Well, if you create a precedent that says that a campus organization can be banned, not for breaking the law, but just because someone perceives their speech or their views to be offensive, then that's going to be used against pro-Palestine students. And that's what we're seeing, right? That the woke left has very much created an atmosphere on the campuses and fought very hard for this notion that if anyone is racist, sexist, homophobic, or has offensive speech, they should lose their rights at American universities. Well, now the Zionists are saying that they consider pro-Palestine speech to be racist and offensive. And on those grounds, they want the universities to administer such policies. Largely, my understanding is that Columbia and other schools, NYU and schools in New York City in particular, the focus of the Zionist students is they claim that the phrase "from the river to the sea" is offensive because it denies them the right to have a Jewish homeland. It's calling for getting rid of a Jewish homeland. They say it's a call for genocide, which is, you can talk about a huge stretch. But regardless, that is their position, that they are offended by the phrase "from the river to the sea." It is anti-Semitic or racist or offensive to Jews on a religious ethnic basis, and so students should be banned from saying it. Well, no, they shouldn't. Students should be allowed to say things, even if it offends somebody else. And the right needs to recognize that, as they've been saying in their defense of free speech. And the left needs to recognize that and see that if you empower universities to punish people for speech that hurts somebody's feelings, that can be turned around against you also.
I think it's also important for those Zionists to remember the actual origination of that statement. That was a pro-Zionist statement. That was an anti-Palestinian. Though that was Zionists saying, we will control this space from the river to the sea. It was the Palestinians that added, from the river to the sea, Israel will be free. They're calling for democracy in the space by using that statement. They're not calling to run people out of the country or to run people into the Mediterranean. That's not what this is. That's not what this is about at all. And final, I want to read this. Get your take on how this language, how this narrative has been and continues to be constructed. Homeland Security spokeswoman Tricia McLaughlin said that on Saturday, quote, in support of President Trump's executive orders prohibiting anti-Semitism and in coordination with the Department of State, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement arrested Mahmoud Khalil because he led activities aligned to Hamas, a designated terrorist organization. As they have co-opted the term anti-Semitism, because this has nothing to do with anti-Semitism, and Jews that are aligned with this issue will tell you this has nothing to do with anti-Semitism, and designating Hamas a terrorist organization. Just that whole narrative is incredibly inaccurate historically, and it is just a convenient way of them using the language, weaponizing the language to support an otherwise unsupportable position.
Yeah, well, it's interesting designating terrorist organizations. So I believe it started in like the 70s or 80s. The U.S. government passed a law designating governments as, quote, state sponsors of terrorism. And that's like the maximum amount of sanctions a country can be subjected to, right? If you designate a country a state sponsor of terrorism.
A la Cuba.
Right. But it wasn't until the 90s that Bill Clinton passed the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which required the State Department to make a list of designated foreign terrorist organizations, and that there is a list of organizations that are designated as terrorists, making it a very serious crime for any American to aid such organizations. And the language about what aiding such an organization is extremely vague. And the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act is not constitutional in my view, because I mean there are things that are protected speech or protected freedom of association that could be interpreted as aiding a terrorist organization, and that list, that designated foreign terrorist organizations list, is highly political, who gets put on there and who doesn't. And it's also not enforced. For example, one group is an anti-Iranian terrorist group called the People's Mujahideen that was aligned with Saddam Hussein during the Iraq-Iran war. And for years, they were on the list, and all kinds of mainstream American politicians like Rudy Giuliani and Tom Ridge and others were going to their events and writing them checks and hanging out with them, and no one said anything. And then ultimately it wasn't until, Hillary Clinton's presidency that she ultimately delisted them as terrorists. But the whole time they were designated as terrorists, there were all kinds of people who hate Iran in the American establishment who were happily fundraising for them and never had any legal concerns. Now Donald Trump recently took the dramatic move of putting a number of gangs, drug dealing gangs from Latin America on the list. The gang from Venezuela, I can't remember their name, on MS-13, they put them on the list. And I thought that was interesting because technically that group, that list is supposed to refer to not, organized crime. It's supposed to refer to political terrorist organizations. What I thought was interesting, though, is the Venezuelan gang that he put on the list. They have been backed by U.S. intelligence historically. I mean, they have been used against the Venezuelan government. They're a prison gang in Venezuela that has been used to orchestrate protests against Maduro, etc. Because of that, they have received U.S. backing. And I noticed there were a number of neocons who spoke up against Donald Trump putting the Venezuelan gang and MS-13 on the list. And the reasons they gave were very odd. They said, well, what if somebody is a drug addict and they buy heroin from one of these gangs? Are they then aiding terrorism under the law? I thought that's odd. That's an odd argument to make. And then they pointed out that a number of these gangs, the Venezuelan gang and the Mexican gang, both have U.S. military weapons. And they said, could U.S. arms manufacturers be charged with aiding terrorism, because they gave weapons to, their weapons ended up in the hands of these gangs. And then I thought, that's an odd concern to make. And then I realized that this is deep state on deep state inside baseball. This is about the fact that there is a relationship between these criminal organizations and U.S. intelligence that is off and on. And these groups are nudged and maneuvered to serve U.S. foreign policy goals, etc. And to some degree or other, Donald Trump and Tulsi Gabbard want to bring that to a stop. And so designating them as terrorists makes it a lot more difficult for the U.S. government to give them weapons. That said, I don't agree with the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. It's not constitutional because the definition of aid is too vague, and people get put on the list without due process. Right? In the United States, they can't convict you of a crime without you going to court and having an opportunity to defend yourself. But the way the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act works is they can put you on it just because the president says so, or just because the U.S. Secretary of State says so. Well, that's not constitutional. You can't declare someone to be so egregious that anyone who does business with you gets thrown in prison without giving them a chance to defend themselves. And there are all kinds of groups on the list that shouldn't be there. I mean, there are groups in Ireland, that are on that list unfairly. There are groups across the world that are on that list, improperly. I think that entire law needs to just be gotten rid of.
Let's shift gears back to the point that we opened with, and that is Prime Minister Fico. On May 15th of last year, Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, was shot and critically injured in the central Slovak town of Hanlova in front of its House of Culture after a government meeting. Sputnik reports the failed attempt on Fico's life was because he sought dialogue with Russia and peaceful political options, said Lubos Blaha, deputy leader of Slovakia's Smer party. Imagine if you have a different opinion and somebody wants to kill you. What is it? This is European democracy now. This is European freedom now. Your thoughts on what seems to really be a devolution in European politics, as they really seem now to be at least more openly shifting and continuing this foolishness with the United States.
Sure. Well, we talked about how biased and ridiculous the state sponsor of terrorism designation is. I think what happened to this leader in Slovakia, and that all points to the fact that one of the main countries that has made terrorism on an international level part of its foreign policy is Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is, if there's ever been a state sponsor of terrorism, it's Ukraine. Someone that I met a number of times in Russia, a brilliant young writer and philosophy student, Daria Dugina, was 28 years old, I believe, and she was blown up with a car bomb by the Ukrainian intelligence services, murdered because she was on a list. She was not a military person, but she was somebody who was very outspoken in support of Russia in Ukraine, and they murdered her. And we know that the shooting at the concert in Russia, the individuals involved in that were fleeing to the Ukrainian border, and they were recruited on a Telegram channel, and that the Russian government is very adamant that horrendous terrorist attack that happened about a year ago, that attack was done in coordination with Ukrainian intelligence services. And we have the shooting of the leader in Slovakia. And then on top of that, one of the guys who tried to kill Donald Trump during the election season, Ryan Roth, you can say he was a lone wolf. He acted alone, but he was what I've called a Ukrainiac. He was a Ukraine-obsessed maniac. He was a convicted criminal in the United States who went to Ukraine and was actively recruiting and working, he says, with the U.S. State Department to bring Afghans to Ukraine to fight for Ukraine against Russia. And he then came back to the United States and tried to kill President Donald Trump outside of Mar-a-Lago. So I think Ukraine is a state sponsor of terrorism, and that again, are we fighting for democracy in Ukraine? Well, I mean, even Donald Trump has come forward and said that that Zelensky is a dictator. I mean, there's no opposition party. There should be elections, but there hasn't been. Ukraine is not a democratic country. When you're outlawing one of the major religious groups, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, when you've outlawed almost all the opposition parties, Ukraine is not a democracy, and Ukraine continues to engage in terrorism around the world. And so all of the talk of state sponsors of terrorism or fighting for democracy, that all falls to shreds when you look at the Ukraine conflict.
Well, and you can even go back to the Maidan coup and the fact that the United States overthrew the democratically elected government in Ukraine in order to instigate this mess. So this argument about democracy is specious at best.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I've noticed that there's a theme in academia over the last couple decades. They've been writing a lot. If you read Foreign Affairs magazine, or you read the Wall Street Journal and some of the academic stuff that they publish in their Sunday magazine and other things, there's a theme of what they call democratic regression, and it is one of the most ridiculous concepts. But it's this argument that they have an election in a country, and it's a fair and square election. And somebody gets elected, and then they change the country, God forbid. And then it's no longer a democracy. And the two examples that they'll use are Venezuela and Russia, right? Things were pretty bad in Russia in the 1990s, and the Russian people wanted things to change. So they had a fair election, and they elected Russian President Putin, who changed things. And he put oil and gas under public ownership, and he was able to rebuild their economy. And he restructured the military and the security services, and Russia's doing a lot better since Vladimir Putin got in there. And nobody doubts that he won the elections. He's wildly popular, but somehow they call that democratic regression, because if you change society, that's getting rid of democracy. And Venezuela is a similar story. Hugo Chavez was elected fair and square, and he got into office and he changed the country, and he started moving toward 21st century socialism. And no question that he's very popular, that he's widely supported. But, that was democratic regression in Venezuela, because apparently leaders are not allowed to get in and change things. They say that these leaders, they're elected democratically. But the argument is they tamper with these, quote, independent institutions like the business community, like the military, like the judiciary. How independent was Russia's, military and business community in the 90s when it was being completely controlled by the United States, and Yeltsin, with the USA meddled in the elections to get Yeltsin to win in 1996, and the country was being looted. So that's independent, right? And the same with Venezuela. How independent was their military when it was, waging war in the countryside against land reformers and disappearing, leftist students and stuff. It's like, if they control it, that's just how it's supposed to be. But if you have a democratic election and elect somebody who changes the way these institutions operate, changes the economy, changes the nature of the military, well, then they're being a dictator because they're tampering with these independent institutions. The whole thing is just one of the most, blatantly, obviously malarkey concepts from American academia. Democratic regression. Basically, if people vote to change society, and if society changes because of popular will, that's not allowed. That's basically what they're saying. And I see this concept in American academia, and I look at this and I'm just like, how can anyone not see what malarkey this is?
Especially when, in the case of Hugo Chavez, you're feeding people, you're housing people, you're educating people, you are providing and you are improving their quality of life by measures that are just off the chart. You can go to Nicaragua and you can say, well, they're now food independent. They're educating people. They're bringing electricity. They're bringing roads. They're improving the quality of life for the peasantry. But somehow that's a problem. I mean, when you take a country like Nicaragua, and you say they're now food independent, food sovereign. When you're feeding people, Caleb, you know what? And see, and this takes me, I'm going to go offline here for a second. This takes me to a point that people have been asking me about the domestic situation and what are the Democrats supposed to do. And one of the things I've been saying is, and I know Hakeem Jeffries is listening because he does watch the program. Hakeem, the first thing you all as Democrats should do is start a conversation with the American people about what is the job of government. That's the conversation you need to start having, not only with Democrats, but with the nation. What is the job of government? And Caleb, thinking about Hugo Chavez and feeding people and housing people and providing medical care for people, looking at Nicaragua and paving roads, providing schools, food sovereignty. That's what government is supposed to do, Caleb Maupin.
Well, the slogan that we've used at the Center for Political Innovation is "We need a government of action to fight for working families." And that is the slogan we've used from the beginning. We use the phrase working families because that's a phrase that was popularized by the labor movement in the 1990s. And we talk about government of action because this notion that the government should keep its hands off and just let the economy go, that's not reality. And that we need to get back to the science of statecraft and the notion that the state has an obligation to improve society and to raise up the people of the country. So, yeah, I believe we need a government of action to fight for working families. And that's why, I do like some of Trump's foreign policy moves, and I am somewhat optimistic despite everything. But at the same time, I see what's going on with the Doge. You can't cut your way into economic growth. It does not work. You get rid of lots of good paying government jobs, there's going to be an economic fallout from that. Well,
and even the narrative around that whole thing about cutting government because government has grown too large, from the data that I've seen, and Kevin Baptiste, thank you so much for that $10 super secret. Caleb and I are throwing it down, and shot put to the chat. Reading and being around y'all is instrumental in advancing my analysis. Well, thank you very much. And folks, we need subscribers. We're trying to get 10,000 subscribers. We need you to click that button. It's not that difficult. In fact, I'll put together a video and show y'all how to do it. It's not that difficult to click that button. And also when you do that, that puts you on the list to receive notices about who's going to be joining us. So you would have known yesterday that Caleb was going to be here with us today. You got to click that button. We really need you to subscribe to the program. With all of that now, I just lost my train of thought and forgot where I was. But anyway, I know where I'll go. I'll go with this. You have a book coming out. And if you would please, I'm trying to figure out where I am in my notes here. You have a book coming out, Caleb. And if you would be so kind as to tell us about the book and
Sure. I just published.
Why demonize Jerry Healy in 2024?
Sure. Well, I have a book that is coming out very soon, and there's a chapter in the book that is a critique of the fact that, there's a Palestine activist who's been dead for 35 years. His name was Jerry Healy, and he was very instrumental in raising the Palestine issue during the 1970s and 80s. And out of the blue, during the election cycle of 2024, Jacobin magazine, one of their writers, decided to publish a hit piece on Jerry Healy randomly. He's been dead for 35 years. Why did they publish it? And if you read this book, which I had a copy of, in the acknowledgments, he admits the book was paid for by Israel. It was paid for by a pro-Israel entity in Britain, the Center for Jewish Studies, which is a notoriously pro-Israel institution, and that they sponsored this book because they saw the global and Israeli Palestine implications of the work. And you read this book, and it's a smear job on a very, very important pro-Palestine activist in Britain who's been dead for quite some time. And I, as somebody who has, studied Jerry Healy, and I particularly find him to be very inspiring, I thought, what's going on here? So I read the book, and the book is full of lies, and the book is full of deception. But it's because they are using Jerry Healy, this very, very important pro-Palestine activist in Britain. They're using him as an example of what could potentially happen if you build an anti-imperialist movement. They almost see him as an archetype of an anti-imperialist movement. And Vanessa Redgrave is a very famous actress. She was very closely associated. And the issue of Palestine nowadays, right, it's kind of trendy in leftist circles, but that was not always the case. Correct. And in the 70s and 80s, it was an issue that you couldn't touch. Many people in leftist circles were pro-Israel, and there was just a fear of touching the issue. But Jerry Healy, he didn't follow that. And Vanessa Redgrave, this very widely loved Hollywood film star, British actress, she went to Gaza, she went to the West Bank, and she made a very powerful film, the first pro-Palestine, widely circulated film, The Palestinian, in 1977. It was screened all over the world. And then she won the Oscar in 1978. And she used her acceptance speech at the Oscar to call out, quote, Zionist thugs and hoodlums who had threatened the Academy, and said that if she won the Oscar, they would blow it up. It was quite a moment. And the organization that was led by Jerry Healy, the Workers' Revolutionary Party of Britain, they were quite active in the miners' strike that happened in 1984. They were one of the main organizations supporting the British miners. And the government of Britain played up the notion that the miners' strike was a foreign conspiracy, that it was funded by the Soviet Union and by Gaddafi. And Jerry Healy was a personal friend of Gaddafi, the leader of Libya. And he flew frequently to Libya. He was Gaddafi's personal friend, flew on his airplane. Then his organization was demolished with what the mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, to this day maintains was clearly an espionage operation. And it was clearly some kind of government coordinated attack, calling the organization a cult. All kinds of rumors and innuendo were used to destroy the Workers' Revolutionary Party and to target Jerry Healy in particular, and to demolish the organization. Now, that all happened 35 years ago. Who cares, right? Well, apparently Israel cares, because they published this big book warning everybody to stay away from organizations that would speak up for Palestine, stay away from such organizations, and using Jerry Healy as like the archetype of what they're afraid of. And the folks at the World Socialist website, who don't agree with me in a lot of my analysis, they did a really good job. They immediately got on top of this book and debunked it, and showed that this book smearing Jerry Healy is just it's just full of dishonesty. One of the claims in the book, to start out the book, they say Jerry Healy told everyone that he saw his father murdered by the British military, the Black and Tans. Well, this is a lie. It never happened. Well, if you actually look at the historical record, there is no evidence of Jerry Healy ever making that claim. None of the official biographies make that claim. His daughter has come forward and said, my father never said that the British military killed his father. But that's the opening section of the book, is all about how Jerry Healy says the British army killed his father and he didn't. And that's what a liar he is. I mean, right there, that's dishonesty. And if you dig even further into it, I mean, it's very odd that the Democratic Socialists of America, Jacobin, that they would take a swing at this long dead pro-Palestine activist who played such a vital role. But it tells us a lot about how the pro-Israel forces are maneuvering. And that's why I wrote this very long piece where I showed that it seems kind of random that they would do a hit piece on a pro-Palestine activist who's been dead for 35 years in the middle of the 2024 election in September of 2024. But it makes sense, because Jerry Healy is kind of the archetype of the kind of anti-imperialist activism that they're afraid of, and the kind of anti-imperialist movement that they're building. One section of the book that's really stood out to me is that in 1975, Jerry Healy and his small organization were falsely accused in the mainstream media of stockpiling weapons. So the British military raided their Marxist education college, and they stormed in with weapons, and they stripped everyone naked, strip searched people, searched their personal belongings for hours. They were held at gunpoint by the police and searched. And at the end of the day, they couldn't find any weapons. They found 20 bullets, but no guns. And the bullets were planted by the police because the charges for those 20 bullets were dropped within hours, by the courts. The courts looked at it and said, no, we don't buy this. And they ended up suing the mainstream media outlets that claimed they were stockpiling weapons and winning a lawsuit, a libel suit. So, they were terrorized with this raid. But, in the hit piece on Jerry Healy, Aidan Betty doesn't seem disturbed by this at all. He just kind of mentions it in passing. And he spends way more time talking about how the Marxist college that Jerry Healy ran was creepy, how it gave people a weird vibe, how they were searching people's bags to make sure they weren't bringing recording devices. So that's suspicious. And it's like he's not disturbed by the fact that the British police terrorized this Marxist organization wrongfully. He doesn't spend any time talking about how they were brutalized. And that reminded me so much of the way the raids on the Uhuru House were trivialized by the mainstream left. And they just didn't seem concerned that, a group of anti-imperialist activists had their homes raided, were terrorized, were dragged into federal court. And they're more concerned about innuendo, that this organization might be a cult, or this organization, this or that, and that's kind of how this kind of cancel culture operation is going. And if you look at the way the Israeli intelligence services have targeted different people, and you look at the narratives that are used to marginalize certain anti-imperialist voices, you can see that there's a reason that they would put this book out. And so I wrote, it went up now on our website at the Center for Political Innovation, a very long, deep dive into Jerry Healy, who he was, Vanessa Redgrave, the actress, the important role they played in pioneering the Palestine struggle, and why the mainstream Democrat Party left and pro-Israeli foundations decided to publish a hit piece on a man who's been dead for 35 years. And so I thought that was worth highlighting. I hope people will check out the piece that I wrote, because there's a lot in there.
And the piece is entitled Synthetic Left Smears Palestine Activist 35 years after his death. You can find it at the Center for Political Innovation. And your upcoming short book is Khrushchevism, a study in psychological warfare.
Yes, and that's
we've got just about 4 minutes. Give us a little bit on Khrushchevism, a study in psychological warfare.
Well, after Stalin died, Khrushchev, his successor, gave the infamous secret speech where he got up before the entire world and said that everything that mainstream media had said about Stalin was true. And that devastated the global communist movement. Many people who'd faced a huge amount of persecution and been imprisoned, had stood and defended Stalin. And to have the leader of the Soviet Union get up and say that, was psychologically demoralizing. The American Communist Party never recovered from it. The French Communist Party lost millions of members as a result of it. And the Soviet Union was demoralized. That kind of set the stage for the fall of the Soviet Union. It was very, very devastating. However, what Khrushchev was doing, it was Khrushchev who coined the phrase cult of personality. That was from that speech. That's the first use. If you ever hear the phrase cult of personality, it comes from Khrushchev. He was tapping into a particular psychological aspect of leftism, right? That leftist politics historically has, very much tapped into the Oedipus complex, right? The desire of young men to kill their fathers, right? And that leftist politics has kind of attached itself to certain psychological tropes that are very, very good, that are very, very easily manipulated in our time. And I use what was done to Jerry Healy and the fact that they're still smearing him in 2024 as one example. There was an anti-communist book, one of the most famous anti-communist books published by the CIA in 1954. It was called The God That Failed. And Richard Wright and Arthur Kessler and a number of ex-communists wrote about it and referring to communism as the God that failed. And there's a certain psychological manipulation that pro-imperialist propaganda is using. You can see it with how the war in Libya was justified. You can see it in the Russiagate hysteria that's being used. And the book, I call it Khrushchevism, and I do a deep dive into many different manifestations of Khrushchevism as a psychological propaganda trope of imperialism in our time.
Caleb Maupin, as always, man, thank you so much for your time. And Rample Sense makes the point that there should be 100,000 subscribers to this program.
I agree.
And, well, because of guests like yourself, I agree as well. And so, folks, click that button. We're trying to get to 10,000, and Rample Sense is saying we need 100,000. And because, with that, the things we could do, if you all like this, the things we could do, the places we could go, the places we could take this whole thing would be phenomenal. And I tell you all the time, we do this for you, but we can't do this without you. So we need you to support this. Caleb Maupin, my brother, thank you so much, man. Greatly, greatly appreciate it. Look forward to having you back.
Sure thing. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, folks. Thank you all for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Subscribers are what we need desperately. Stay tuned. Robert Fantina is going to join us tomorrow. Please follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show, share the show, share the show. Follow us on social media. All the links are below. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. Robert Fantina is my guest. Until then, I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have the remainder of a wonderful, wonderful day. Peace. I am out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.